Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us here at 4:30. After both presidential candidates make their case to Wisconsin voters last night, Donald Trump in Green Bay and Kamala Harris in Madison, the state receiving a respite today. However, when this countdown reads 3 days plus, they're going to be back again. The former president will be in Milwaukee tomorrow night, and the vice president will be in Little Chute and Milwaukee tomorrow night. In their absence today, surrogates doing their bidding, which is where we begin Your Voice, Your Vote coverage. Tonight, former President Bill Clinton in Oshkosh today, visiting with volunteers at the Winnebago County Democratic Party headquarters. He was assisting a canvass launch as Election Day nears. He also encouraged some early voting and down-ballot Democratic voting, contrasting Donald Trump's agenda and Project 2025, of course, with Kamala Harris's policies. Clinton will continue his tour of the Badger Battleground State. In fact, he is down in Milwaukee in that area as we speak. But let's speak now with our chief political reporter, Jason Zimmerman, who was there in Oshkosh for the former president's visit today. So, Jason, was this about voters or building up the get out the vote volunteers?
Chris, I think it's clearly about getting the vote out and motivating the people who were at this event today. Many of them have already early voted. But his message is not to stop. Take this right up until the time polls close on Election Day. We can't take anything for granted. If you have a friend, a family member, anyone that you know that has not voted, it's your job to get them to the polls. And of course, he kept talking about spreading that message. Talk to people about the differences between these two candidates. He attempted to highlight Harris on a number of issues, especially the economy and affordable housing, touting her plan to go after companies that price gouge, and also to give first-time home buyers a $25,000, up to $25,000 in support towards a down payment. And he believes that that's one counter argument the Democrats can make towards, independents or even Republicans right now that are considering voting for Donald Trump in the next few days if they haven't already done so.
All right, Jason, our first chance to chat with you since you were at the Donald Trump rally last night at the Resch Center here. Certainly that is a base-oriented event, right? I mean, he is there. That is red meat for the base. But I'm curious, were there messages in there for that really small sliver of undecideds that are still out there? We know this from the MU Law School poll that came out yesterday. Those are the ones that very well will determine this election.
Well, I think that's part of the reason he's here in Wisconsin, especially Green Bay, is trying to reach out to those undecided people. I mean, that was, I think, part of the play in bringing Brett Favre in there, and getting his endorsement, bringing him to Green Bay, where he's, still very popular, and filling that arena last night is to try to maybe appeal to some Packer fans using football or other methods to try to just to get somebody to tune in and listen to him speak. Maybe they wanted to hear Favre and they stayed for some of the message, or even maybe they listened to what Favre had to say, because Favre got up there too and making the case for Donald Trump and why he believes he's a better option than Kamala Harris. So I think that's still the game plan for both of these candidates, going into this final stretch. And I think we're going to continue to hear more of that in the days to come.
Yeah, including tomorrow, as we mentioned, right down the road there in Little Chute. The vice president will be there tomorrow night, then head to Milwaukee, where, as we mentioned, Donald Trump will be tomorrow night. Do you think this might be it tomorrow, or can they squeeze maybe a few more visits to our area in before Tuesday, Jason?
Well, Chris, that's an interesting question. It's something that I've been asking the campaigns about. Are you planning to come back to Wisconsin ahead of Election Day? Of course, they're planning to be here Friday, so it's probably unlikely they'll be back Saturday or Sunday. But Monday is the wild card. It's possible. I can tell you that. Off the record, at least one of the campaigns told me that a vice presidential candidate could be back at least somewhere in the state on Monday, but nothing's been confirmed. There are some big battleground states out there, and I suspect there's going to be a lot of concentration still on Pennsylvania throughout the next few days. But you can't count out a possible trip back to Wisconsin for one or both of these candidates on Monday.
We may see somebody trying to pull off a 4-pack on Monday, try to hit 4 battleground states. It'll be fascinating, the frequent flyer miles that are going up, right? All right.
Exactly.
Jason,
and that happened last 4 years ago where you had the candidates. Thanks, Chris.
All right, Jason, we'll talk to you again coming up on Action 2 News at 5.